Good morning and welcome to the third beautiful day of the Bluegrass Charity Festival, brought to you by your American Legion Post 149 right here out of Jasper. Gonna start off this beautiful Sunday morning with Miss Allison Scurry. She's gonna do some beautiful gospel music for us.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start out with singing Precious Lord, Take My Hand, and then we can sing Amazing Grace together. We'll sing the first two verses, and then we'll repeat the first verse again. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, help me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. When the day draws near, precious Lord, linger near. When my life is almost gone, hear my cry, hear my call, hold my hand, lest I fall. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. When the darkness appears and the night draws near, when the day has passed and gone, at the river I stand, guide my feet. Take my hand, take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, lost, but now I found. Was blind, but now I see. Thank you.
All right, I heard the round of applause, but can we get some amens out there for Miss Allison? Awesome job. Next we have, for our invocation, Bud Champlin. He is the chaplain of Post 149 of the American Legion.
Let us pray. Dear Lord, let us not fail to continuously give you the glory for all you have provided. You have provided a country where the rich, excuse me, I'm just nervous, Lord. You provided a country where the poor are rich by the world's standards. A country where our students can be the most learned in the world. A multitude of first responders, the police, firefighters, emergency personnel who are willing to risk their own lives. A medical field second to none. But Lord, I especially want to thank you for our military, those currently serving, and our veterans who obtained and preserved our freedom. We started this weekend expecting great music, fantastic food, and vendors with unique and creative items. We have received all of these. Thank you, Lord. We thank you that we live in a country where you can be born in a cabin in the backwoods of Kentucky, self-educate yourself, and become one of the greatest presidents. Lord, help us to keep these things in perspective, because we are a blessed people, and we give you the glory. In Jesus' name, amen.
All right, it actually says Ray is supposed to introduce our next person.
Okay. Thank you. As I mentioned early on, sometimes we have a little communication problems, and usually it's mine. So I want to thank all of you for being here today. It's a special day, it's Mother's Day, and we all want to thank those of you who came out to see our Sunday service, and which we think is kind of special, and I think you'll find out that it is very special. I want to take this opportunity first to thank the vendors that have stuck it out here. I mean, we really appreciate it. We know we had a few leave because they were not, but we want a special hand for those guys that stuck with us. Thank you very much. And now, it is my extreme pleasure to introduce a former president of the United States, and as Bud Chapman says in his invocation, his prayer, that one of the greatest presidents, perhaps the greatest president we've had. Anyway, we've got him, we resurrected him, and Homer Sewell, who portrays Mr. Lincoln, has done this for basically his lifetime. He's appeared in front of over 2 million people in the United States, in 46 states, I believe it is. And just this past weekend, he was in Illinois for an appearance. And in addition to his portrayal of Mr. Lincoln, he is a veteran, and he's a member of our post. And we're very grateful that he has donated his time and his talent to our Sunday service. And with that, I would like to introduce to you the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Good morning. How's everybody doing? Appreciate you inviting me down here today. It's always good to get out of that mess in Washington. I want to tell you a few things about my life. You guys like stories? I got some stories for you. Before I get started, let's give another big round of applause to Allison, who's done a great job all 3 days of singing for us. She is one fantastic singer. Let's give her a big round of applause. Thank you, Allison. 206 years ago, in a little small dirt-floored log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, it was a Sunday morning, February the 12th of 1809, I came bouncing into this world just exactly like every single one of you did, crying. My sister Sarah was already there. She was 2 years old. And Sarah and Ma and Pa and I got along just fine in that little cabin there in Kentucky. We stayed there until I was about 7 years old. And then Papa decided we'd move out of Kentucky up to Indiana. 2 years later, something very sad happened in my life. Does anyone know what happened when I was only about 9 years old? My mama died. The cows had gotten out and eaten this grass called snake root grass. It poisoned the milk, and if you drank that milk, you could get sick and die, and Mama did, and so did some aunts and uncles, and it was a very sad time for my sister Sarah and for me. Sarah did her best to take Ma's place as far as the cooking and mending and keeping that cabin clean, but I gotta tell you something, folks, Sarah could not cook. She'd either burn it or she wouldn't cook it good enough. After about a year went by, Papa came to us one day and he said, Abraham, you and Sarah take good care of yourselves. I'm going to make a little trip back down there to Kentucky where we used to live, and I might bring you back a surprise. Excuse me. Papa went down to Kentucky, looked up a widow lady that he had known from when we lived down there. Her name was Sarah Bush Johnston. Her husband had died. She had had 3 children from this previous marriage, John, Elizabeth, and Matilda. He went up to her and he said, Miss Johnston, I don't have time for any long courtships. Would you marry me? Well, he must have been a pretty good salesman because he talked her into it. They got married right on the spot. Papa loaded up the big wagon with her 3 children and all her furniture and brought her from Kentucky on up to Indiana. When they got up there, my new stepmama took my sister Sarah and me under her wing just like we were her own children. And she loved us very much, and we loved her, and she kept teaching us all about reading, writing, and arithmetic. And I sure did love to read me a good book. I had a favorite book. Does anyone know what my very favorite book was? Let me give you a hint. I'll bet you can guess. I'll bet every one of you has one of this kind of book, and you take it to church or synagogue with you on Saturday or Sunday. The Bible. Not only was the Bible one of the few books in my cabin, but it became one of my favorites, and I learned a lot of good lessons in the Bible. Things are going along pretty good. Got a new stepmama, new stepbrothers and sisters, but there was one little problem. This cabin we'd been living in had been a very small cabin before Mama had died, and there'd only been 4 of us in there. And now with my new stepmama, my stepbrothers and sisters, there was 7 of us. It was so crowded, every time we turned around, we were bumping into somebody or a wall. Papa decided he better build us a new, larger cabin. We sure needed it. He did, and we got moved into it, and I've got to tell you, it was a fine cabin. It had wooden floors instead of dirt floors, had more windows in it to let more light in, had a loft area for me to climb up in to sleep at night, and it even had a whitewashed ceiling. One day not too long after we got moved in, all 5 of us children were outside playing in the yard. There was Sarah and I and John and Elizabeth and Matilda, and my cousin Dennis was also there, and I looked over, and Dennis was over playing by this big watering trough where we watered all the horses and the cows. Some of that water had sloshed over and made mud, and Dennis was playing in the mud. He was the muddiest, dirtiest little boy you'd ever see anywhere. Now, even when I was real young, I was already very strong from all that wood chopping I've been doing, helping my pop in the garden, building fences and barns and cabins. Well, I got so strong I could hold a big heavy axe right straight out. I went over there to Dennis, and I said, Dennis, why don't you come on in the cabin with me for just a few minutes? I want to play a little trick on my new stepmama. Now, I loved her very much, but I just decided I'd play this little trick on her. So I picked up Dennis and took him inside that new cabin, held him upside down, and marched his muddy little black footprints all across that new whitewashed ceiling. And then we went outside and hid in the bushes to wait for Mama to come in out of the garden where she and Papa had been working, to see if perhaps she might notice what was up on the ceiling. Pretty soon we saw her head into the cabin. She looked all around, and she stuck her head outside the door of the cabin. "Abraham, come here." "Yes, Mother, what is it?" She said, "Abraham, what is that up on the ceiling?" "Well, Ma, it looks to me like some kind of little black footprints up there." She said, "Abraham, how do you suppose they got up on the ceiling?" I said, "Mama, do you reckon there's been a ghost in our new cabin walking around the ceiling?" She said, "Now, Abraham Lincoln, you don't really believe in ghosts, do you?" Well, I got to tell you, folks, that even when I was real young, I always told the truth. So I fessed up and I said, "Mama, I was the one that did that to play a little trick on you. You know who got to repaint the ceiling that day, don't you?" Well, I kept growing up and getting bigger and stronger, read everything I could get my hands on. When I was about 19, I was doing some work for this fellow by the name of James Gentry. He came to me one day and he said, "Abraham, would you and my son Alan like to build a boat, a flatboat, take a boatload of goods, a 1,000-mile journey down the river to New Orleans to sell for me?" I said, "Oh, yes, sir. We can handle that." Sounded like a pretty big adventure, didn't it? So we proceeded to build this boat 16 feet wide, 80 feet long, had a little cabin on there so we could get in and out of the weather. Got the boat all built, loaded up with all these big barrels of fruits and vegetables and meats and some other goods that Mr. Gentry wants to take down to New Orleans to sell for him, and including some live pigs. I thought we'd never get those squiggly things all loaded up, but we finally did, and we headed down the river to New Orleans. Do you folks reckon we were able to make it all the way to New Orleans without having any trouble of any kind? No, sirree, Bubbaroo, we did not. I'm here this morning to tell you that life is not going to always deal you a straight and narrow road to walk down. Someday you might have to do a little zigging and zagging like that old river did for 1,000 miles to get where you want to go. But do you ever give up? No, you don't ever give up. I never gave up, and I don't want any of you to ever give up in the pursuit of whatever it is you want to do with your lives. You can become and achieve anything and everything you want to. Just don't ever give up in that pursuit. There's nothing we want more for each other in life than success. So I'm going to give you some secrets to help you get there. Starting today, I want each and every one of you to learn to be dreamers, stargazers, rainbow chasers, and to soar high with the eagles. And folks, you can't soar with those eagles if you're clucking around the ground with the chickens and the turkeys. And you know what we did with those turkeys last Thanksgiving and Christmas, don't you? Well, we finally did get down to New Orleans. Not only did we sell all the goods for Mr. Gentry, we even sold the old boat we had built, and we booked passage on a big paddle wheeler to take us back home. But while we were there in New Orleans, we decided to do a little looking around. This was the biggest town I'd ever seen anywhere. My goodness gracious. Well, it'd be like you taking a trip over here to Talking Rock or somewhere really big like that. We saw some things there in New Orleans I didn't like one bit. I saw some folks there tied up, chained up, caged up. Slavery. And I turned to Alan and I said, "Alan, I don't like this slavery issue one bit, and if there's ever anything I can do about it, I will." We finally did get back home. The trip had taken us 3 long months. I got paid a whopping $24 for that 3 months worth of work. $8 a month. Almost as much as we pay our teachers these days, unfortunately. Well, I got back home and I just couldn't get it together. I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. A couple of years later, when I turned 21, Papa decided we'd move out of Indiana up to the Decatur-Springfield area of Illinois. Now, at age 21, a young man's supposed to go out on his own. But Papa came to me and he said, "Abraham, times are kind of rough. Could you stick around and help support the family for another year or so?" So I agreed to do that. About a year later, I'd had enough wood chopping to last a lifetime. I finally packed up my few belongings, moved over about 30 miles outside of Springfield to a little village over there on the river called New Salem. When I arrived there in New Salem, I did several things. I did some storekeeping, postmastering, blacksmithing, surveying, nothing very successfully. Had several stores in Wink Alamy, as a matter of fact, but I never gave up. Does anyone know where I carried the mail when I was postmaster in New Salem? Let me give you a big hint about where I carried the mail. This is called a stovepipe top hat, and it's got a lot of room, so you can carry all your mail and all your important papers there, and that's exactly what I did. But there's one problem with carrying the mail in your hat. Every time I'd be walking down the road there in New Salem trying to deliver the mail, and a lady would come walking towards me, I'd take my hat off to tip it to her as a gentleman should, and the mail would fall out all over the muddy road. So I had to quit carrying the mail in my hat. One day a family stopped by my store. They came in and they said, "Mr. Lincoln, we're heading out west. Our wagon is so loaded down, there's barely any room for the family. And on the back of the wagon is this extra barrel of goods that sure is in our way. They wanted to know if I'd give them 50 cents for that barrel and getting off their wagon." I said, "Folks, that's a lot of money for a barrel you're telling me doesn't even contain much of any value, but I suppose I can help you out. You bring that barrel into my store." And they did. I gave them 50 cents for it. They headed on their way out west. I stuck the barrel over in the back of the store because I didn't have time to worry with it right then. Sometime later I went over and I was just going to pitch it out the door. But I decided I'd take a look through that barrel just to see what I'd gotten for my 50 cents. I got to tell you, I was a little bit disappointed until I got all the way down to the bottom of the barrel. Does anyone know what was in the bottom of the barrel that day? A complete set of law books. Blackstone's Commentaries on Law, the most comprehensive set of law books available back then. And the more I read and studied and thought about being a lawyer, the more excited I got. This looked like something for me to give some serious thought to. I went over to Springfield and talked to this lawyer friend of mine over there by the name of John Stewart. He said, "Lincoln, I think you'd make a great lawyer. Why don't you come on over here to my store, or to my office when you're not busy there at the store. I'll teach you all about being a lawyer." Back then, you didn't have to go to law school. You just had to study with somebody. So for the next several years, every chance I had, I went over there, read all of his books, helped him with his court cases, did lots of studying and research. And in '36, I was ready to take the bar exam there in Illinois to become a lawyer. I took it. I passed. And I became a good, honest lawyer. I'll let that soak in for just a minute. Well, a year later, I left New Salem, went over to Springfield, and joined Mr. Stewart as his junior law partner. And we had us a fine law practice going there in Springfield. And I got to tell you, folks, things were going along pretty good in my life. At least they were for a couple of years, until '39. Something happened in '39 that changed my life a whole bunch. I got invited to go to a dance. Any of you ever been to a dance? Now, I don't know whether your dances these days are like they were back in my time, but back then all the ladies were on one side of the room, all the fellas were over on the other side of the room, and then once in a while they'd get together and ask one another to dance. I was over on the side of the room with all the fellas, and they kept after me. They said, "Lincoln, you met Miss Mary over there a while ago. Why don't you see if you could talk her into dancing with you?" So I finally got up the nerve to go ask her to dance. I stepped all over her toes with these size 12 boots. I squashed them down pretty good. And in spite of the fact that I'd stepped all over her toes, we started going out. It got kind of serious. As a matter of fact, it got so serious, we set a wedding date. We were going to get married. But guess who didn't show up for the wedding? Now, folks, this is not a difficult question. There's only two choices. How many of you think Mary showed up for the wedding? How many of you think I failed to show up for the wedding? You're absolutely right. Mary showed up. I chickened out. I told you I wasn't ready for women folk. Finally, after about 15 months went by, I was looking in the mirror one day and I said, "You know what, Lincoln? There's probably not another woman in the whole state of Illinois who'd even have anybody as ugly as you are. You better get on over there and see if perhaps Miss Mary's still available." So I finally got up the nerve to go visiting. I went over there and apologized for not showing up 15 months earlier, and we started going out again. It got serious all over again. We set another wedding day for November the 4th of '42. That time, both of us and the preacher showed up. We did indeed get married. In the next 10 years, we had 4 boys, Robert, Eddie, Willie, and Tad. Now, I rented us a nice place there in Springfield for a while, and then after about a year, I bought us a nice big house over at 8th and Jackson from the preacher that had married us. Didn't pay him but $1,500 for it, and we raised our 4 boys right there in Springfield, and I was back and forth between lawyering and politicking. I almost forgot to tell you, that's what happens when you get to be 206 years old. Back in '32, we'd had some trouble with the Black Hawk Indians there in Illinois and up into Wisconsin. I volunteered for about 3 months, and I want you to know, they elected me captain of that little Army group, and it was one of the proudest moments of my life to have been elected their captain. I also started to get into a little politicking there in '32. I was going to run for Illinois State Legislator, but I lost. I didn't give up. 2 years later in '34, '36, '38, and '40, I ran and I won, and I was a good, honest politician. Something we need more of in Washington these days, by the way. Well, in '46, I ran against Preacher Cartwright for Congress, and I won. And then I decided I'd get into a little more politicking. In '58, I ran against this little short fat guy by the name of Stephen Douglas for Senate there in Illinois. He wasn't but 5'4". I'm 6'4". They call us the long and the short of it. Judge Douglas and I had 7 debates all over Illinois, and I thought folks pretty much liked what I had to say. But I reckon they must have liked what the judge had to say better, because I lost that Senate race in '58 against Judge Douglas. I still didn't give up, and 2 years later, in '60, I ran for the big office, and guess what happened then? I won that one. I became your 16th president. Right before that election, I got the nicest letter from a little 11-year-old girl by the name of Grace Bedell. She lived up in Westfield, New York. Miss Grace wrote to me and she said, "Mr. Lincoln, I think you're going to make a wonderful president. If you have any little girls, would you ask them to write to me? And by the way, Mr. Lincoln, I think you'd look much more handsome if you grew some whiskers." Well, I got to thinking about that. I wrote back to her and I said, "Miss Grace, I don't have any little girls. I got some boys. I'd be happy to have them write to you. And do you really think I look more handsome with whiskers?" Well, about that time I lost my razor blade and I started getting this stuff growing on my face. February the 11th of '61, we had that train all packed and ready to go from Springfield to Washington for the big inauguration. It was a very sad time for Mary and for me. One of our little boys, little Eddie, had already died there in Springfield. He wasn't but 4 years old. There were already rumors of an assassination attempt on my life, but someone had that train stop by up in Westfield, New York, and somebody went to fetch Miss Grace Bedell and brought her down to the train station so she could see her new president with his new whiskers. Don't you ladies think I look more handsome with whiskers? I don't care what you guys think. We did get to Washington. The inauguration was on March the 4th, and I officially became your 16th president. Within 5 weeks of that date, on April the 12th at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, some shots were fired, and the great Civil War, war between the states, war of northern aggression, whatever you want to call it, began. There were 11 southern states, including the one we're in here today, who felt that they should be able to have and maintain their slaves. And that, along with some other things that were going on, like states' rights and the slavery issue, we started this 4-year-long conflict, and I thought it would never come to an end. Finally, after a couple of years, some things happened that looked like it might turn it around just a little bit. January the 1st of '63, I signed into law a big long document called the Emancipation Proclamation. And I did with the issuance of that document exactly what I had said I would do when I was only 19 years old on that trip down the river to New Orleans with Allen Gentry, and began the process that ultimately freed the slaves of this great country of ours. July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, outside the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, there was another battle. At that one battle, over 60,000 soldiers from the north and the south were either killed, wounded, or missing in action. The townspeople of Gettysburg, in burying these dead soldiers in a 17.5-acre portion of this big battlefield, decided that since this had not been just any ordinary battle, it certainly could not be just any ordinary cemetery. It needed to have national dedication and national recognition. That date was set for Thursday, November the 19th of 1863, and a lot of very important people were asked to come speak. My friend Edward Everett, great senator and former governor of the state of Massachusetts, traveled all over the country giving speeches and talks, was asked to be the main speaker of the day, and finally on November the 2nd, just 2 weeks ahead of time, I received a telegram there in Washington at the White House asking me if I could come and speak a few appropriate remarks. Just a little short talk with the emphasis on short. I was very busy with the war effort, but I also knew the importance of what had happened there at Gettysburg. As a matter of fact, it had become a major turning point of the Civil War, so I agreed to go speak. I wrote my little speech there in the White House, revised it slightly on the train on the way to Gettysburg, and revised it again for the third time in the home of Judge David Wills, the family that I stayed with there in Gettysburg. I'd like for you, if you will, to pretend that you've got a time machine that you could go back 152 years. Let's pretend it's Thursday, November the 19th of 1863. You're gathered outside the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, at what was a great battlefield. A small portion of it is now being dedicated as a cemetery. There's over 20,000 of you gathered, and some of you way back in the back of the audience can't even hear what's being said. There was no public address system back then, and it wasn't until you read it in the newspaper days later that you even knew what had been said. You've listened to my friend Edward Everett get up and ramble on for 2 solid hours. You have been bored to death. You've listened to other people speak. You've listened to bands play. Finally, you look down through the crowd and you see a big, tall fellow with a stovepipe hat and a black coat heading toward the speaker's platform, and you realize it's me, your president, getting ready to speak to you. You're all excited because you've heard what a great speaker I am. But some of you are to be a little bit disappointed. You felt that as your president, I should have spoken to you for a much longer period of time, when in fact, my speech was less than 3 minutes long, closer to 2. Only 2 minutes, 22 seconds, 272 words long. The photographers of the time, Matthew, Brady, and Gardner, and others, couldn't even get those big, bulky cameras with theirs set up in time to take a picture of me talking. Because by the time they had their cameras ready, I'd already sat down. My speech was over with. Before I tell you what I said that day, let me tell you that I have in my wallet a $5 bill with my picture on it, and I'll give it to the first one of you who can stand up and tell me just the first 3 minutes of what Edward Everett said on November the 19th, 1863. History teachers, professors, anybody? We don't know what Edward Everett said. We don't even care what Eddie said. The point I want to make to you is this: when you're asked to get up in front of a group and give a talk about something, it doesn't necessarily matter how long that talk is. It's what you say and the number of words you put together. The proof is that after 152 years, we do not know what Edward Everett said. He had rambled on for 2 solid hours, but some of us are still studying about what I said, and I spoke for less than 3 minutes. How many of you a couple of years ago when you were in school learned the Gettysburg Address? Let me see your hands. Ray's got his hand up. I see some other veterans and some others of us that are a little bit older have their hands up. I'm proud of you. Folks, without a shadow of a doubt, we live in the greatest country anywhere in the world. And anytime you've got a doubt about that, pack your bags and take a trip to Russia or China or Cuba or somewhere where they even today do not have the freedoms that we do here in America. You won't be able to get back here to this piece of Georgia fast enough. But I'm going to tell you something. Unfortunately, in our schools in America, we're getting away from basic patriotism. Such things as requiring our students to learn the Gettysburg Address, the preamble to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and other things that have meant so much to this great country over the years. It bothers me, and I hope it bothers you some. That's why in the past 40 years, I've given away hundreds of thousands of copies of my little speech and encouraged our young people to learn this speech. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is rather for us the living to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Well, the war wound down after that battle at Gettysburg. Before we leave 63, I want to point out something to you. How many of you know what national holiday I signed into law in 1863? Anybody know? So next to the last holiday of the year, it happens in November, and it's got something to do with turkeys. Thanksgiving, this coming November on the fourth Thursday. Our young folks are out of school, you're out of work for a day or so, and you're gathered with family or friends and giving thanks to God for all the great things He's given you this year, including a wonderful country to live in, a great state to live in. I want you to offer up one more thank you. Thank you, President Lincoln, for the holiday, because I was the one that gave it to you. The war wound down. In 64, I was encouraged to run again for a second term. This time, when someone suggested that if I picked a Southerner for my vice president, we might have a better chance to win. So to replace Hannibal Hamlin from the state of Maine, I picked Andrew Johnson from Tennessee. We ran, we won, second inauguration again on March 4th, this time in 65. Within 5 weeks of that date, on April the 9th, at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, General Lee surrendered to General Grant, and the Great Civil War finally came to a conclusion. In total, there had been over 3 million soldiers involved. 620,000 had lost their lives. 2% of our entire nation of 32 million at the time had died. It's no wonder, folks, that no matter how hard you look in any book anywhere in the world, you will never, ever find a picture of me as your 16th president smiling. I had nothing to smile about. Not only, excuse me, had the war been going on the whole 4 years I was your 16th president, but another one of our sons, little Willie, had died there in the White House at the age of 11. It was a very sad time for this great country, and a very sad time for Mary and for me. When it was all over with, Mary started talking to me about taking her to a theater somewhere to relax and forget about the war. I said, Mary, I don't have time to go to any theater. I've got a country to put back together again. But she kept after me about it until I finally agreed to go on Good Friday, April the 14th, just 5 days after the war had ended. I'm not going to tell you what happened that fateful evening, except to say that I had a real bad experience with an actor by the name of John Wilkes Booth while we were watching the play at the Ford's Theater, Our American Cousin, with a starring actress by the name of Laura Keene. Let me leave you with these thoughts. Sometime in your futures, you might be having some difficult times and wondering how you're possibly going to make it to another day. When that happens, I want you to look back to today when right here, thanks to American Legion Post 149 here in Jasper, in this beautiful setting, you saw someone dressed up as Abraham Lincoln. And when you're wondering how you're going to make it to another day, I want you to stop and give some thought to this. If a big, tall, ugly guy like me could make it from a dirt-floored log cabin, past all kinds of sadnesses, from my mom dying, my sister dying, my girlfriend dying, my father dying, 2 sons dying, one store failure right after another, one political failure right after another, Marfan's disease on top of all that, without ever giving up, and going on to become president of the greatest country anywhere in the world, don't you ever give up in the pursuit of whatever it is you want to do with your lives, because, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I'm here today to tell you, it cannot ever be as hard on you as it was on me. Be dreamers, stargazers, rainbow chasers, and soar high with those eagles. You can indeed become and achieve anything and everything you want to with your lives. Just don't ever give up in that pursuit. Now, I want to leave you with a little poem I wrote. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge that Miss Mary Todd is here with me today. Miss Xenia is here. She just had complete hip replacement 4 weeks ago tomorrow, so she's here to come and see her president, and I appreciate her being here. Let me leave you with this poem that I wrote for you. The Creator made a lot of things, some summers and 1,000 springs, the mornings and the afternoons, the sky, the sea, the mist and moon, the mountain winds, the new mown hay, the little running brook and the ocean spray. And then there are some things you see that He made especially for me. Red roses, yellow daffodils, the sunlight on the purple hills, cobwebs pearled with morning dew, a certain shining star, and you. Thank you very much.